Okay, well, thank you very much for the very kind words, and good morning. I'll be speaking the next 23 minutes on the anatomy of the limbic lobe system, the cytoarchitectonic aspects of that, and the connectivity. Now, many of you, when they hear the word limbic, the heart will sink. And the reason is that it's not always very well defined, it's not very tangible, and there is something obscure about it. And the reason for that is that it is slightly obscure and not well defined. The word limbic is used in the context of a limbic lobe, of a limbic system, limbic cortex, and limbic function. What does the word limbic actually mean, and where does that come from? It goes back to Thomas Willis, who first used the word limbic, and by that he meant simply an anatomic description about the cortex which is around the brainstem. No relationship to function or anything, nothing obscure, just a descriptive term, it was written in Latin, about the part of the brain that is around the brainstem. That then evolved through Broca, who to the 5 known lobes at that time, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and the insula, added the so-called limbic lobe. The limbic lobe, in the way that he described it, is well defined, and it was further described and refined by Duvernois, among others. And he subdivided the limbic lobe into 2. The limbic gyrus, or the outer limbic gyrus, which consists of the subcallosal gyrus here, which goes on the cingulate gyrus, which is the biggest part, goes around here into the isthmus, and then to the parahippocampal gyrus. And as you probably know, usually in our clinical routine, the parahippocampal gyrus is the 5th temporal gyrus, so it's a gyrus that belongs to 2 lobes. Not very logical, but there you go. But this is the limbic gyrus. So you start here, subcallosal, cingulate, isthmus, and it is one structure to the parahippocampal gyrus. You have the same here. This is the part that I just mentioned. And then in that, you have the inner intralimbic gyrus, which is this part here. You start here with the anterior part, the prehippocampal rudiment. You go around with the indusium griseum, longitudinal striae, which goes around the corpus callosum, and then finally you come here to the hippocampus, or the hippocampus proper. So these are the 2 structures which are within each other. The anatomy of the hippocampus also sometimes creates some headache, and actually it is not that complicated. If you think of it as just simply 2 C-shaped structures which are within each other. That's what it is. That's the difference between other parts of the brain. And the other big difference is that in the brain, usually, you have the gray matter outside, the white matter inside, in contrast to the spinal cord. The spinal cord, you have the white matter outside and the gray matter inside. The exception in the brain is the hippocampus, where you have on the surface the fimbria alveus, which come together to form the fornix. We'll see that in a second. So, you all know that from previous times, at least, that originally it was thought to be one plate. There happens some folding, and then you have these 2 structures which get interlocked as C-shaped into each other. Yeah? So these are the 2 C-shaped, and that's it. And they spread from anteriorly, where you have the amygdala, posteriorly to the posterior part of the hippocampus. You can see that, obviously, in histological section very nicely. That is the cartoon of it, where you have here outside the white matter, inside the gray matter, and you have these 2 C-shaped structures. You can see that not so good on a bad 1.5 image. On a 4.7, you can see the substructure is much better. At 7T, you can also see it, and you see it best with MR microscopy at 9.4 Tesla, where you can image for hours. You don't have any pulsation artifacts, movement artifacts, or anything else. And then you can really get a wonderful resolution that is unparalleled and that can match quite well what you see in histological stains. So that's the one aspect, which is the well-defined grand lobe limbique by Broca, which is still used in anatomic textbooks. Now let's have a quick look at the cytoarchitectonic substructure of the brain. In principle, you have the very big neocortex or isocortex, neocortex, which is the most of the brain. That is the newer cortex. It's called the isocortex because it's always 6 layers. That's the thing about it. The older cortex, the paleocortex, archiocortex, periarchiocortex, it's not less complex. It's not just always 6 layers. It can be less, it can be more. Now, in terms of limbic, we are here more interested in the old brain. You see that here in the sketch from out of Yashagul's book. Most of it is, as I said, is isocortex or neocortex, and you have here the paleocortex, and the archiocortex, the cingulate, and the periarchiocortex, where you have here the Cingulate Gyrus and the Insula. So, some define the limbic lobe as being the allocortex, archiocortex, periarchiocortex, or in other words, everything that is not isocortex, which means you have expanded the whole thing quite considerably beyond what the original anatomic description was. So now you have the insula included, which wasn't before in the limbic lobe as it was described by the anatomist. So you have a bigger area, you have less well-defined borders, and you have differences depending on the author that has just written the paper you're reading. From this, there emerged a concept of having within the brain 2 different divisions. One that is more olfactocentric, which is more based here on the olfactory cortex, on the orbitofrontal cortex, and more a hippocampal-centric division, which is based on the hippocampus, and you can subdivide then many parts of the brain according to how much they have of this division or of that division. And that brings us to the limbic system. The limbic system was, at least since Papez in the 1930s, considered as one system that deals with things and then it becomes fluid. What does it deal with? Emotions, memory, not well defined. So the more current concept is that you have 2 systems, or at least 2 systems. This is advocated 2. I'll come to that in a second, that some advocate 3. So 2 systems consisting of limbic and non-limbic components. That means we're not talking now about the lobe. We are talking about something different, about a function. And the problem is of using the word limbic. When you talk about the motor sensory system, we know what we're talking about. We're talking about motor sensory. We talk about language, it's language. With limbic, limbic means border. And the origin of the whole issue is that with emotions, at the beginning when the whole thing started, we had difficulties in calling it the emotional system or the memory system. So this is how the whole thing was grouped, and this is what creates problems to us when we read that. So 2 systems is the modern concept. One more emotional, anterior limbic system, consisting of the orbitofrontal cortex, the amygdala, dealing with emotion, reward valuation, reward-related decision-making, and value representations, which is then transmitted to the anterior cingulate cortex. The other is the episodic or hippocampal limbic system, consisting obviously of the hippocampus and the posterior part of the cingulate. The main tracts of it are the fornix, which connect the memory, connect into the mammillary body and from there into the anterior thalamus, and related to the posterior cingulate cortex and circuit. Main function is along the memory, episodic and event related. And this is some of the most important tracts that relate that. You see here the orbitofrontal cortex and the amygdala. They are, amygdala would be here, orbitofrontal cortex there. So you have this blue tract, the uncinate fascicle, which connects them. And you have then the other areas. So this is obviously more olfactory-centric, and this is more the hippocampus-centric. And you have here the subdivisions. Catani also proposed, in addition to the 2 here, the more olfactory-centric and the more hippocampus-centric, a third one which relates to the resting state. We have to see how that will take up. That's just to let you know that there is another view. We can see actually on the FLAIR images differences, and we can identify aspects of the limbic lobe or system, because the signal intensity on the FLAIR of the allo and archer cortex is higher than that of the isocortex. That was shown some time ago. So in other words, limbic lobe and insula have a higher signal than the other lobes. It seems that this should be related to the water content or cellular composition or vascularization. It's obviously not very clear. But if you keep in mind what I just showed you a moment ago on Yashar Gil's sketch, what do we have? We have here this area, the cingulate, which is higher signal. We have here this area, which is higher signal. This area here, where you have the amygdala and the hippocampus and the campus here, they all have higher signal. Also, the insula. They all are slightly higher in signal, and you see that also on the DWI images. And when you want to establish contrast to noise ratios, you also see that here the should be cingulate. The cingulate gyrus and the insula have a much higher than all the others. And that actually, if you're not careful, it is one of the reasons why we have problems with CJD, where you have a higher signal quite often in some of these areas, the cingulate and the insula. So let's go back. The limbic system. Let's talk a little bit on the emotional and the anterior limbic system, the cingulate gyrus and the insula. So the cingulate gyrus can be subdivided into 4 subregions from a cytoarchitectonic point of view: anterior, mid, posterior, and small part, which is the retrosplenial cortex. Obviously, you know the cingulate goes around here. We said that, isthmus parahippocampal gyrus. So if you just look at this area here, you have the 4 areas: anterior, middle, posterior, and the splenial area. Especially the difference between, sometimes this is grouped with the anterior, the posterior are seen as being quite different in function and in connectivity. The insula is slightly more complex from its outer shape, has the form of a triangle, 3 anterior short, 2 posterior long gyri, and they are separated by a sulcus, which is also called the central sulcus of the insula, and the triangle is surrounded by the Lehman insula. So this is what you have. You have the insula here, surrounded by the Lehman insula. You have 3 anterior short gyri, 2 posterior long ones, separated by the central sulcus of the insula, and here you have the insular pole. Cytoarchitectonically, it's slightly complex too. Brodmann's view from 1908 was that you have, along the line of the central sulcus of the insula, separation into 2 fields. But that has shown not to be the case. It's different. You have, in the posterior part of the insula, several areas. You have posteriorly the granular insular cortex, more anteriorly an agranular insular cortex, and in between a zone that is intermediate. Now that is interesting, because if you look at, that's the kind of subdivision that was suggested between granular and agranular and then dysgranular or intermediate zone. To understand the function of an area, we need to look at its connections. Where are they connected to? What is it connected to? There are various ways we can do that. We can do that obviously with tracers, with dissection and so on, but if you want to do that in vivo, you don't have many options. But you have, through imaging, modern options, which is DTI tractography, and from a functional point of view, functional MR. And coming back to my subdivision of the insula, we can see and identify by looking at the connectivity at the subdivision of the insula. You have the agranular, which seems to be connected to the amygdala, hippocampus, other areas, the middle part, BA44, and the posterior part, the granular, which is more connected here to the parietal lobe. And you can see these different areas that are color-coded here. Looking at the fMRI connectivity, you get a similar subdivision into 3 parts. So you have a nice relationship here. You know your anatomy, you know the cytoarchitectonic subdivisions, and you have the same subdivision by looking at the fMRI or DTI connectivity.
And of course, we have now the advantage of doing that in vivo, so assessing the individual. You know that the cytoelectronic fields is not like Brodmann has done. They're not fixed. They're actually quite variable from one individual to the other. So we have now the possibility of looking at that. Looking at the resting state from a functional imaging connectivity point of view, you have two networks, one on the anterior insula, where you have the more attentional, and posterior you have more the sensory motor network. And they are related to the cingulate. You can never look at just one area on its own. And this is we talked about the memory and the emotions, and obviously they are related, but the emotional saliency monitoring network is in the anterior insula. It integrates. It integrates information coming from the inside, interoception, with information on our emotional states. And then you get the feeling of how you are. I mean, that's probably where it happens. So if you feel relaxed now, slightly tired or slightly full after a nice breakfast, or hungry after having had a breakfast, this is where it comes from. The emotional salience and the information of the inner body. We'll come to that in a second again. And then you have a general salience and action system, which is all of the insula. And that's more about the environment, monitoring the environment, what's happening around me, who's talking in front there, what am I, how am I feeling. The problem is that when we talk about functions and emotional functions and other related functions and look at what is in the insula, for example, and in the cingulate, it's quite a lot of things. How can we group them? We can group them into four: sensory motor, chemical sensory, cognition, social emotional. And we can see where they are, for instance, in the insula. So in the posterior part of the insula, the posterior middle part, you have here gustation. Then you have close to it visceral sensory. That means the feeling of the guts or of the heart, and so on. You have your primary temperature area and your primary pain area. They are on the back here of the insula. And all this is information about your body state, about how you are. So coming back to the emotions, and you can subdivide them. There's obviously a lot of research happening on that, what they are. And if you look at what is within the limbic system and here in the anterior insula, you can have certain emotional status that is related to, that's reflected in a bilateral activation. For instance, awareness of mistakes, feeling of knowing something, time, perception, decision-making. And then you have also things which are just on one side, either the right or the left. It was shown that on the right side you have more issues which relate to arousing of the body, attention to heat pain, subjective cooling, self-recognition. On the other side, you have positive emotions, affiliative emotions, so maternal affiliation. Keep in mind, these images are the way that neuroscientists look at it, so it's the other way around. It's not the way that we, as radiologists, neuroradiologists, look at it. And, of course, romantic emotions. So one of the things that in life play one of the biggest roles. So one of the problems, it seems to be, this is a paper written by a woman scientist, seems to be that throughout the ages, philosophers, anthropologists, writers, anatomists, psychiatrists, and sexologists have tried to decipher the sense, nature, and function of a woman's sexual pleasure. So the question that she puts is, does sexual pleasure and love intensity share the same neural basis? So looking at that, she looked at 29 heterosexual women intensively in love with one partner, dating, engaged, or married to their partner for a mean of 16 months, right-handed, normal vision, no drugs. And she made a functional imaging study and presented the target, which is the person they are dating or they are with, and other pictures and some nonsense pictures, and presented them in the fMRI. And then there was a questionnaire about scores, you see here, orgasm scores, and they tried to relate them to each other and to see where do they overlap. what is the function, what is the relationship between the two? And they saw that actually within this part of the insula, anterior insula, this is where you have the relationship between the two. And then they looked at these cores and the various parts of the brain, and again it was around the insula and the putamen where you have the best and the strongest relationships. From that, they concluded that there is, on this so-called passionate love scale, from this they concluded that, that there is an overlap between the two networks. And this brings me to an old hypothesis, which is the so-called somatic marker hypothesis, which comes about feelings and emotions. When you have emotions, how does this work? And the theory is that we interpret as an emotion what we feel in the guts, the feelings that are coming. So the idea is that in very early childhood, a relationship was made between certain emotional status and certain feelings or certain happenings within the body. So when you say you have a heartache, actually it is some feelings that the heart aches. And this was a theory that was put forward about 100 years ago, as I said. And it is about the representation of interoceptives, providing the basis for subjective feelings. And it is still of importance nowadays. And the idea is, it seems, that, again, in the insula, you have a processing from posterior to anterior. First, you have what we saw about temperature, pain, visceromotor, visceral sensation, and so on. And this is what's called homeostatic representation of our physiological conditions. That is then moved forward, and you have another integration anteriorly with stimuli coming from higher sensory regions, from the environment, so outside. So that's inside, that's outside. And that's integrated together in the most anterior parts. And this integration of homeostatic information, the outside environment, the sensory environment, together with other information, the social conditions, motivational conditions, and so on, somehow comes together to give you what has been described in different terms, maybe at the global emotional moment, which is the moment that you feel now, the now being about 4 seconds. And where does this happen? The theory is that this happens near the junction of the anterior insula and the frontal operculum. So the idea is you get here the information from within the body, you get here the information from outside, it gets integrated, you get this feeling, you get this, and then you need to do an action, and the action therefore has to go to the anterior cortex, which is where it happens. So that is, you have in a way an input-output system. The input system is the anterior insula, the output system is the anterior cingulate cortex. And in pathology, this is seen if you have a lesion, for instance, in certain parts of the insula, you can get an impairment of recognition of emotions. You have this mass murderer, and they made a study showing him some images, people in despair. And they asked him, what do you feel? How do you interpret this image? And he said, no idea. But the people, just before I killed them, they look like that. So he cannot, and this is one of the things, they cannot interpret emotions. Certain lesions. I'm not saying that he had that lesions, but it is one of those aspects. A lesion showed that there was a reduction in the urge to smoke. Certain changes in the gray matter seem to be related with schizophrenia, or, for example. So, in summary, I think one of the issues why we have problems with limbic is the definition. We talked about that, about the ground lobe limbic, which is well defined, whereas limbic cortex system are not so well defined. So when you read a paper, make sure you pay attention to what they define, or what paper they refer to. You have 2 limbic systems, one emotional, one memory, anterior hippocampal. And there's an important integration happening within the limbic system between the cingulate gyrus and the insula, which is important for the emotion, the homeostatic system, and our awareness. Thank you very much.